Thank you for joining me at Kung Fu Podcast, episode number 139. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what Kung Fu Podcast was designed to do, and I'm your host, T.W. Smith. Welcome to the program, and whether you are a teacher, a practitioner, you practice for health, you practice for sport, you practice to be able to protect yourself, or you practice to have a philosophical way of life. Or you may be in a place where you're doing a little bit more than one at a time, but all of us usually begin with one driving force, and then we might migrate into others a little bit later. If this is your first time to Kung Fu Podcast, welcome to the program. I'd like for you to know that I genuinely appreciate you including me as part of your martial arts journey. Now, if you happen to miss episode number 138, you're going to probably want to drop back and start there. And for those of you who follow me, you may have noticed that I had miscounted a little bit in part one because during the closing I said we had covered 2 turning points of William Fairbairn's biography. But just in all fairness, after I had rewrote my notes for the 3rd time, I forgot to change the number. You know, we all make those little errors along the way. But during that podcast, we examined Fairbairn's first stint as an officer and a patrolman, the multitude of clashing forces that he was going to be dealing with, corruption, the political ideology that was at battle, and of course just good old-fashioned power struggles. Then we shared an account of a story where Fairbairn was on patrol and he discovered a Japanese vessel with over 100 Chinese citizens on the deck with their hands tied behind their back. And basically, you're going to have to just drop back to number 138, part 1, to get all those details. But near the end of that episode, I began reviewing a list of Fairbairn's early publications. Before we explore some of the consistencies and the tangents in Fairbairn's methodology, plus a couple of more turning points that we've got to look into, let's start this program the way we finished, with a quote from William E. Fairbairn, where he writes, quote, "The methods described in this book I have carefully worked out and developed over a period of many years. They owe something to the famous Japanese judo, jiu-jitsu, and something else to Chinese boxing. But largely, they were developed from my own experience and observation of how most effectively to deal with the ruffians, thugs, bandits, and bullies of one of the roughest waterfront areas in the world." End quote. So here we go. Let's continue the biographical sketch of William Fairbairn by delving into portions of what he was teaching. If you look through Fairbairn's books, and as he is referenced by many, many experts, he emphasized striking. He says that in his world, locks and ground fighting was ineffective as attacks and would get you, the officer, hurt or killed. Now, it's not that he didn't use any locks, but using them as a form of attack was not anything that was in his portfolio of teaching. Defendu includes quick strikes. They're applied to critical areas so that you can get control. They are highly practical and effective in hand-to-hand combat situations. The use of the knife hand or shuto hand technique is something that he talked about a lot and how to train it. The palm strike that Fairbairn refers to as the chin jab involves angling the hand backwards, spreading the fingers, and slamming the underside of the opponent's chin. The tiger claw is also another technique that he uses a lot and teaches a lot when facing a frontal attack. It's carried out by curling the fingers as if holding a shot put, and you strike with a piston-like motion. His styles also include several kicks, but they're mainly designed to attack and damage an enemy's legs and knees. Well, the Shanghai police force focus had to take a new twist in 1937. The Japanese Empire had attacked and overran much of China. Suddenly, Shanghai was one of the few places on the east side of China that was not currently occupied by the rampaging Japanese army. So in addition to dealing with the huge influx of refugees that almost doubled the population of the city, where everybody else was just trying to get away from the Japanese invasions and the killings that was coming with it, Fairbairn's officers had to deal with the escalating fights between the Japanese troops and the Chinese citizens. And then, after a few years, the following quote is attributed to the late Carl Sestari, where he writes, "Fairbairn's career with the SMP, the Shanghai Municipal Police, came to a close in 1940. He retired with the rank of Assistant Commissioner. During his tenure of over 3 decades, he had been involved with hundreds upon hundreds of violent clashes between Mao Zedong's Communist Red Army and Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang forces. He had seen the invasion of China by the Japanese and the bloody and brutal siege of Shanghai and the surrounding provinces by the Imperial Japanese Army. He had worked closely with the SMP Special Branch, an intelligence gathering unit that operated covertly throughout Shanghai. It was with this tremendous amount of experience and real-world savvy that Fairbairn would enter the next phase of his life." End quote. Which brings us to turning point 3. Fairbairn goes international. At this point, Fairbairn moves into a full teaching mode. Many military, law enforcement, secret services are seeking him out to consult, teach, and develop systems of combat as well as armed and unarmed tactics training. I am not going to take as far down Fairbairn's international consulting roles after this third turning point because it isn't necessarily as relevant to traditional martial arts as it would be to military, paramilitary training, and the carrying out of policies. But I do want to touch on a few things that you might want to know about. At CIA.gov, they write, quote, "President Roosevelt established the Coordination of Information, the COI, in 1941 in response to a need for strategic information during World War II. As a result of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Coordinator of Information was reorganized, and on June 13, 1942, it was renamed the Office of Strategic Services. When the OSS began training agents for overseas operations, Fairbairn was recruited to develop and provide close combat training programs, including the use of his fighting knife. Fairbairn trained some future directors of Central Intelligence, including Richard Helms and William Casey, and all that happened at the camps located in the national parks of Maryland and Virginia. During Fairbairn's training program, he warned his students to avoid engaging in a knife fight if at all possible. In fact, Fairbairn names the knife as the most deadly weapon of his training manual titled Get Tough. Fairbairn says that in close quarters fighting, there is no more deadly weapon than a knife. An entirely unarmed man has no certain defense against it. Further, merely just the sudden flashing of a knife is frequently enough to strike fear into your opponent, causing him to lose confidence or to surrender." End quote. By 1941, Fairbairn was working really hard with Sykes, traveling to various training schools and giving instructions. Then in 1942, you have the book published All In Fighting. Then 2 books that had started in Shanghai but were not finished, The Self-Defense for Women and Girls and the Shoot to Live book, which was co-authored by Sykes, were also published in 1942. As I'm bringing his life sketch to the close, after the end of the war, Fairbairn was released from service and was again a civilian. He began training police and soldiers in his systems both in 1951 at Cyprus and then in Singapore. What was William Fairbairn's legacy? What did he bring to us in his research and practice of the traditional martial arts, and as well as his military and law enforcement career? We know that he is a man who revolutionized self-protection, and he made it extremely effective and practical for law enforcement and as well as civilians. By the reports I saw, apparently he didn't cuss or swear a lot, and he didn't boast about his accomplishments. He was one of the chief pioneers of close combat, and his techniques for protection are widely accepted and used to this day. Police officers, military personnel, and martial arts students around the world utilize portions of his training and his teaching as part of their combative training, whether they know it or not. William Fairbairn defined close combat as a means of fighting an enemy hand-to-hand or within 20 yards range. He was so well respected and renowned in close quarters combat that when the books Get Tough and Hands Off were released in the United States, a letter of complaint was sent by the New York Police Department to the headquarters of Special Operations Executive, SOE, who we mentioned earlier that he became a part of. The New York Police Department didn't like the fact that their own criminals were going to be able to learn these new methods. As a martial artist, here are some of the important things that I noticed about William Fairbairn during the research of this podcast. I read over 17 articles, portions of several of his books, and I can tell you from what I researched, he was committed to his martial arts training and to the people under his charge, the people he was teaching. As tough as he was, he didn't try to just teach one system that was then morphed to try and make it work. From what I gathered through the research, he educated and taught the people in his charge the mindsets, skills, and techniques that was appropriate for them to meet their objectives. So he didn't just give everybody one system and say, hey, yeah, this is the way to do it. He said, here's what you're going to need to know to carry out your objectives. And he taught in that framework. He emphasized striking, and any holds and locks were usually demonstrated to either escort or subdue the enemy. They were not taught as a way of getting control, but as a way of carrying out an objective. The control was taken via striking, whether those strikes were delivered by hands, elbows, arms, or legs. He had the edge of the hand blow that I usually refer to as the axe hand. He had the tiger claw that we mentioned earlier, the chin jab, some of the kickings with the edge of the boot. He was a big proponent of delivering knees up toward the testicles, and as well as the thunderclap, which was the strike to the ears. He put a real emphasis on footwork, which was taught to allow for effective movement on uneven ground, slippery ground and stairways. Remember, he was a foot patrolman on the most dangerous waterfront that has ever existed. So when he was teaching, he was very clear about the competitive arenas or sports or other things that you might practice inside of a gym or on mats or on dry, even surfaces would not apply when you were out in the field. On a personal note, if you've never busted your rear end or came close to it by using poor footwork or poor technique on wet grass, loose leaves, slick pavements, or concrete, then you've never really tested your footwork in a realistic place outside of the martial arts studio. I can tell you all about the very first time I was working Xing-Yi and I saw my feet fly out from under me and my head was where my rear end had been just a moment before. So when it comes to practicing your footwork and your martial arts skills, I would encourage you to get outside and do some work in areas that would be appropriate to your community or wherever it is that you live. In Fairbairn's work, he put a lot of emphasis also on weight transfers to increase impact. And one of the things that he emphasizes several times in his books is what he calls the denial of reaction time. All your strikes are supposed to be non-telegraphic. There should not be any noticeable preparation, no telltales, no giveaway. He also taught masking your intent. Fairbairn regarded the eyes as a prime target, but they were not to be attacked directly because anytime you would go for the enemy's eyes directly, it would create a natural defensive instinct. But by using the chin jab or the tiger claw, the eyes could get attacked indirectly, and that was also very effective. I noticed that almost all of the techniques that Fairbairn taught were open hand techniques, and even one instance where he references how much more effective it was than a clenched fist. Another thing that I liked about Fairbairn's teaching is that he also taught body responses. So it's not just a matter of hitting this and hitting that. He actually would go into the detail about what you could expect when you hit this or when you hit that. And these body responses, which we call asking or inviting, simulate what the body is naturally going to do. For example, a knee near the groin or the abdominal area is going to bring your enemy's head to you. And of course that shortens the distance, and you have to be aware that his head is coming to you, so you're going to need to move a little bit. That is something that is great to try to simulate a little bit in your pad drills. Fairbairn also makes use of less standard but extraordinarily effective techniques, many of which we discussed in the episodes The 3 Dimensions of Violence. So for example, if you're grabbed from the front like in a bear hug where they're trying to throw you in somewhere, his teaching as far as responding to that was not very fancy. He said first, try to bite his ear off. And if he doesn't let go, and he avoids it by pulling his head back, this will certainly put his testicles close enough so you can squeeze them to escape the hold. So I would encourage you, before you practice that, make sure that you put on your ear muffs and a good cup. When it did come to a couple of the locks and holds, what you might call a gooseneck escort or something along those lines, he wrote, it should be understood that this hold is not a method of attack, but simply a mastering hold, which is applied only after you have partially disabled or brought your opponent to a submissive frame of mind by one of the follow-up methods. He walks you through on how to get up from the ground, but his emphasis is clear. Do not go to the ground. If you do, you've only got a little moment of time where you're going to have an opportunity, and he does teach 2 or 3 different ways of getting up. But perhaps one of the most important things that I would encourage you as a martial artist is to remember the following that William Fairbairn writes. He says, quote, you must face the fact that a man fighting for his life or to prevent capture is a vastly different person from one you may meet in competition. It is an established fact that a man in fear of death will be prepared to undertake the lifting of 5 times the weight he would in normal times. Also, that he can, under such circumstances, take about 5 times the usual amount of punishment. End quote. William Fairbairn, in his book Get Tough, also talks about how to get away from come-along grips and as well techniques on how to use a stick. There are some of these things that have nothing to do with self-protection. They are totally military skills. For example, stalking to attack, where he demonstrates how to get a sentry. And as well as he teaches lethal techniques, how to kill the enemy, which are well beyond the scope of civilian martial arts. For example, one of the techniques is called the Bronco kick. But for the people in the military, that was totally appropriate. But for a civilian martial artist, there would be no reason to execute such a technique on an enemy who is already down. So with William Fairbairn, he had some turning points in his life. And the first one shows up when he was 15 years old when he joins the Royal Marines. Then later, he joins the Shanghai Municipal Police Department, and at around the age of 22, he is stabbed and left for dead, but decides he's not going to quit. Rather, he goes and learns traditional martial arts, the Japanese martial arts and Chinese martial arts, and he uses that to become a presence of justice. It was those early experiences that laid the foundation of a pragmatic and unbending perspective on violence and the martial arts. William Fairbairn died June 20th, 1960, at the age of 75, leaving volumes of training and influencing many, many lives in close-quarter combat. So there we go. There's part 2 of William Fairbairn's biographical sketch. But I got a couple of things. I just jotted a note down here. I said martial reflections, and I want to pose a couple of things to you to think about. And if you want to, please write me. You go to kungfupodcast.com/contact and send me a note, or on our Facebook or Twitter accounts. I'd love to hear from you. But my thoughts out loud after doing this episode and the research, I pose this question. Has violence in criminal profiles really changed that much in the past 250 years? Now, after doing a little bit of looking into it, I can tell you that that question in itself is worthy of its own podcast. Yet one of the things I found in a fantastic research essay titled Historical Foundations and Current Applications of Criminal Profiling in Violent Crime Investigations. It was published in the year 2000, authored by Michael Woodworth and Stephen Porter, who I have reached out to see if I can bring you the whole research essay in an audio format. But they did write, quote, Serial crimes of a sexual and or homicidal nature continue to represent a major concern to the public. They continue by giving you an example of this criminal named Olson by writing, after numerous children and teenagers were murdered in British Columbia between November 1980 and August 1981, Olson became a suspect and was arrested. Unfortunately, he was released and continued to murder children until he was apprehended for a second time. Olson was eventually convicted of 11 counts of murder and sentenced to 11 concurrent life sentences." End quote. But when it comes to the research of profiling, particularly behavior, it starts off really sketchy because the church was one of the first that used it. Woodworth continues by writing in the historical highlights, "The documented history of profiling can be traced at least to the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, a text from the late 1400s written by contractors to the Catholic Church for the purpose of accurately identifying and eradicating witches." End quote. They continue by referencing Mr. Franz Gall from the late 1700s, who developed a pseudo-medicine and a pseudo-science called phrenology, which basically was his development of predicting a person's psychological characteristics by the shape of their skulls. Then it gets into the 1800s, 1876 to be exact, where they reference the Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso, who had authored The Criminal Man, and through their author's research they continue all the way out until the 1990s. The methodology changes a lot, thank goodness, from, you look like a witch to, hey, you got a weird shape to your head, to at least a more forensic approach, and that is still utilized to this day. And then when we look at organized criminal activity, we have the mid-1700s, the Bowery Boys and the Fly Boys were bumping around in the 5 Point areas of New York City. In the mid-1800s, everything gets stepped up by the 5 Points gang that now have politicians and law members in their web, which would bring us up into the 1900s, where Al Capone is a force. Realizing that the types of crime and vices really haven't changed a lot. And by most accounts, most gangs specialize and then have supplementary criminal activity. A criminal's willingness to carry out violence to meet their objectives doesn't appear to have changed a lot. Now, their methodology and the weapons have, but the personalities really haven't. So if you give me just a moment or two, I'm going to circle back around to my point. But I want you to think about it in the sense that it's fun to hypothesize a lot of times about legends. Would have Muhammad Ali taken Mike Tyson? Would Johnny Unitas been able to win a Super Bowl today? Could that basketball player, what's his name, LeBron James, could he have played the game that he plays today in the time where the bad boy Detroit Pistons were putting people on their rear ends, or against the brutal Boston Celtics like Michael Jordan had to? That was, in my opinion, a great time to be watching the NBA. Well, we can have those kind of time warp legendary discussions all the time, right? And we really don't go anywhere. They're just opinion and intellectual massaging. But if we can agree that using modern methodology, that a violent criminal's profile hasn't really changed a lot over the past 250 years, so we don't really have to go through this time warp. And what I mean by that, if Al Capone was here today, or if he would have been around in the 1700s, he would have most likely been involved in some shady and brutal business undertakings. And that brings me back to you, the martial artist, who you might be practicing for any number of reasons. But there's one fact you really want to be aware of, and that is today in the United States, with modern technology and 911 phone calls, radio, and fast cars, according to American Police Beat, the average response time for an emergency call is 10 to 12 minutes. And Nashville, Tennessee is one of the fastest places in the country, and they come in the lightning speed of 9 minutes. Well, did you know that in the 1920s, particularly in China, there was virtually zero personal electronic communication? There was barely any government electronic communication. The wars, the civil wars, China had the Ministry of Posts and Communications, which was designed for mail and telecommunications, and that was mostly for the Chinese rail network. It was intended to unify funding for steamship lines, railways, telegraph, postal facilities, and to fund general industrial development. So basically, the only way you were going to get help back in the 20s is by running and screaming. So can you imagine what the response time was in the 1920s to an emergency call or emergency yell anywhere in the world? Just to be gracious, let's say on average 30 minutes. And now that brings me to my martial arts question. Let's say that you live in this area, or you did live in the early 1900s, could have been Chicago, or could have been in Leeds, Nottingham, or Sheffield with the 1920 Sheffield gang wars, but you are now in the exact same time period as William Fairbairn, who is working and teaching martial arts in Shanghai. And guess what? At exactly the same time, there's another guy who is teaching martial arts just 650 miles away. His name is Sun Lutang. Both are working and teaching the martial arts, both are publishing books, and this is all happening in exactly the same time. So you might have heard of both of them. But let's just say you wanted to protect yourself to some degree. You want to protect your son, your daughter if needed. You may need to be indeed the only source of justice and protection for 30 minutes until police or help arrives. If you have a chance to learn martial arts and both of these respected men are teaching, who are you going to first learn your martial arts from? Sun Lutang's philosophy about close quarters combat and hand-to-hand combat was a stark contrast to William Fairbairn's. In fact, William Fairbairn's philosophy sounded much more like Wanzhang Jiang's philosophy. Little nonsense and no ambiguity. And it was in one of these moments, as I was doing the research for this episode, that it struck me. These men were nearly city neighbors. They existed in the exact same time zone. They both practiced traditional martial arts. They were both respected teachers, authors, and were remarkably different as well. It was also one of those rare opportunities that you didn't have to go through a time warp to compare two legends and their legacies. Neither of these men were interchangeable. Both had a purpose and were obviously successful at achieving their objective. To bring this to a close, I put together a very nice extra outline to William Fairbairn's biographical sketch that I'm going to record a little bit later and make it available there at Kung Fu Podcast. That's going to include why William Fairbairn becomes like a superhero legend, and there were some real reasons behind it. Take care of yourself. Have a fantastic practice, and I'll be talking with you again soon.